Welcome to the Altruistic Libertarian, advocate for a genuinely free society. I'm Anthony Wheeler, and today we continue a case study of our deadly highways, followed by a potential solution. Government intervention in transportation has taken three major forms, each of them contributing to the cost in human lives and suffering. Government ownership of the transportation system has created distortions in the market that have prevented the creation of safer, faster, and cheaper alternatives. The first is the most serious. The government is legally exempt from legal suits stemming from death or injury on the highways. In a genuinely free society, every organization is liable for the products, service, unsafe conditions, or negligence that result in harm. Anyone injured by such an entity can sue. If that entity is found guilty, they pay restitution to the injured party. They may also be required to change specific practices to avoid injuring anybody in the future. Perhaps an example would be helpful to illustrate the point. This is from an article from May 4th, 2017. The family of a Kansas boy who was killed while riding the world's tallest water slide last summer will receive a settlement of nearly $20 million, local media reported on Thursday. Caleb Thomas Schwab, 10, died of a neck injury in August of 2016 at the Schlitterbahn Water Park in Kansas City while on the water slide known as the Verrückt, or insane in German. The boy was found dead after finishing a ride on the slide, which sent riders plunging 17 stories at up to 50 miles an hour. He was riding on a raft with two women who suffered minor injuries when the incident occurred, police said. We are thankful to have reached a settlement with all parties. We will be removing the ride from our Kansas City park when given permission by the court, which we have yet to receive. The boy's death prompted legislation last month to tighten restrictions on amusement rides in the state. In November, water park officials said the company would close the ride permanently and eventually tear it down. One boy perished, and the ensuing lawsuit cost the operator millions and forced the operator to close the ride. If the courts can take so much of one fatality, absent the explicit legal exemption granted to the operators of the highways, it can be easily projected that the damages that would be sought and obtained by those injured in auto accidents would be immense. No private operator could afford to remain solvent or obtain insurance. In a genuinely free society, such a transportation system simply wouldn't exist. But such liability suits cannot be brought against the government, even though the government builds and maintains the roads and highways. This was demonstrated some decades ago when an investment group wanted to build a private highway in Nevada. No speed limits and no highway patrol. They secured the funding and the rights of way, yet foundered when they were unable to obtain insurance. Unlike government-owned highways and roads, they wouldn't enjoy the same protection from liability and would suffer damaging lawsuits stemming from the inevitable and unavoidable accidents. Without the exemption from liability, they couldn't afford the insurance, as anyone injured could sue them. Any industry that injured and killed its customers, like the highways do, would quickly be put out of service, out of business, and rightly so. The government institutions that own and operate ground transportation are legally shielded from such lawsuits by the same lawmaking entity that operates and regulates the system that kills and maims so many innocent people every day, every year, year after year. The transportation system is largely owned and operated by the government. As such, there is no correlation between how the service is used and what it costs. Aside from tollways, it doesn't matter where a person drives. The cost is the same: gas, depreciation of the vehicle, incremental insurance, etc. The capital investment required to build one road or another remains irrelevant. There is no attempt to recover the cost of capital or match the cost with use value or make sound decisions on future investment. In some cases, highways are vastly underused, where in others, commuters would be better off riding tricycles, the traffic jams so pervasive. The link between income, that is taxes, and expense or investment, road maintenance, expansion, future builds, is tenuous at best. Traffic studies greatly colored by political considerations drive the level of investment. In many areas, the infrastructure has greatly declined, particularly bridges and overpasses. There is no objective way to make investment decisions that balance value and cost. Consider the following. This is quoted from the U.S. needs $926 billion infrastructure investment. This was printed on January 14, 2017. Quote, U.S. Transportation Secretary Anthony Foxx announced late last week that a new report on the state of America's transportation infrastructure, titled The 2015 Status of the Nation's Highways, Bridges, and Transit, Conditions and Performance, confirms that more investment is needed, not only to maintain the nation's highways and transit systems, but to overcome a nearly $1 trillion investment backlog. He says, Secretary Foxx says, we have an infrastructure system that is fundamental to the nation's economic health, and it needs greater attention and resources. Improving our nation's bridges and transit helps create jobs, connects communities, and ensures that our nation is equipped for the future. Secretary Foxx added that the congressionally mandated report confirms that projections outlined in Beyond Traffic, a U.S. Department of Transportation study issued in early 2015 that examined the challenges facing America's transportation infrastructure over the next 30 years, such as a rapidly growing population and increasing freight traffic. The new report, commonly known as the Conditions and Performance Report, identifies an $836 billion backlog of unmet capital investments needs for highways and bridges, or about 3.4% more than the estimate made in the previous report. Addressing the growing backlog, while still meeting other needs as they arise over the next two decades, will require $142.5 billion in combined transportation spending from state, federal, and local governments. In 2012, the most recent year in which the report's data were available, federal, state, and local governments combined spent $105.2 billion on this infrastructure, 35.5% less than what is needed to improve highways and bridges. Quote, the case for more investment in our nation's transportation system is clear, said Federal Highway Administrator Gregory Nadel. A strong transportation system will make businesses more productive and freight shippers safer and more efficient while improving America's quality of life. This report shows the impact of the lack of investment in infrastructure, said Acting Federal Transit Administrator Carolyn Flowers. The results of that neglect can be seen throughout our country as both reliability and safety suffer. We must increase investment in public transportation nationwide because we must take immediate action to bring our transit infrastructure into a state of good repair and provide the world-class service that Americans deserve. This piece illustrates the case perfectly. While the cost can be generally calculated, no effort is made to quantify the benefit. This hampers the issue in both directions. On the one hand, lacking any form of beneficial estimates hamstrings any effort to prioritize the use of available capital, ensuring that lesser value products will be funded, whereas some essential ones will go unattended. In other words, there may be projects that promise to return several times their cost in a short amount of time, but they may never be funded without having the proper information. On the other hand, significant waste is inevitable, if unreportable, given the lack of benefit analysis. The odds of making proper decisions concerning the nation's infrastructure approaches zero. These issues do not arise in privately managed institutions. Do businesses make bad investments? Every day, but with two crucial distinctions. One, they generally know when something fails and by how much. And two, any company that makes too many bad investments ceases to do business, eventually. In contrast, nobody will know if a particular government infrastructure project was a success or failure in terms of value, and no government agency will cease to exist as a result. There are no consequences for making good or bad investment decisions. Do private entities pass on promising investments? All the time. In some cases because capital wasn't available due to excessive government spending. There were two situations that triggered my thinking seriously about transportation. The first was a project to build a private road in Nevada, mentioned earlier. The second was a Coronado Bridge in San Diego. My father was a naval officer stationed in San Diego. We lived in Imperial Beach, the most southwestern city in the U.S., bordering it as it does Mexico and the Pacific Ocean, before the bridge was built. We left for 3 years, and when we returned, there was a new bridge connecting San Diego and Coronado, the bridge having opened in 1969. The case of the Coronado Bridge provides an interesting case study in transportation economics. Originally, the toll was 60 cents in each direction. Several years later, this was changed to a $1 toll collected for traffic going westbound to Coronado only. Although the bridge was supposed to become toll-free once the original bridge bond was paid, which occurred in 1986, the tolls continued for 16 additional years. There was so much traffic and therefore toll revenue that the bond was paid off in half the time originally projected. The bonds didn't cover funds received by the federal government, so we can't be certain that the bridge paid for itself. But it appears that such a project could have been developed, funded, and operated profitably by a private entity. It's impossible to say for certain, but it seems plausible. One more interesting point. Before the bridge was opened, there used to be a ferry that ran from downtown San Diego to Coronado. This ceased operation due to a law prohibited competing businesses within a certain distance of a state toll road. This seems somewhat oxymoronic, as the government owned and operated the bridge, and the only way you could prohibit competition was to prevent monopolistic prices or to threaten revenues. But given that the tolls were set and would not increase even if it made economic sense to do so, outlawing the competition seems unnecessary. The purpose was to provide transportation for the public. Why remove one of the options? The Coronado Bridge example is relevant because any transition from government-owned transportation to private options would involve payment for use. Tolls would be necessary in order to provide opportunities for alternatives. Privately funded and operated transportation won't succeed or won't even come into existence if the government provides it for free. Consider the following thought experiment. What if the government owned and operated all grocery stores and all the goods within the store were free, paid for from tax revenue? Shoppers could take anything they wanted from the shelves at no direct cost to themselves. If this happened, the shelves would soon become bare, and the government would have to continually raise taxes to pay for more goods. The government could never keep up with the demand, and no privately owned and operated stores would exist, for how could you compete with free goods? That is why the freeways are so crowded in some places. The government cannot build them fast enough to keep up with the increasing demand, and the demand keeps increasing because they are free. Only now, as they become so crowded that they no longer function, are alternatives being sought. But any alternatives must be government-owned and operated as well. Like the trolley system in San Diego, a giant step into the past. How can a private operator compete with free service? They cannot. So privately funded and operated alternatives will never arise. As long as the government owns and operates the highway system, things are unlikely to change. The government has given itself the right to expropriate property from landowners whether the owners wish to sell or not. This practice is called eminent domain. Eminent domain, the right of the government or its agents to expropriate private property for public use with payment of compensation. Eminent domain has been used extensively to build and extend government roads and highways. The expropriation of private property directly contravenes the principles of a generally free society, a society where free individuals possess property rights that cannot be violated. You know who doesn't have eminent domain? China. Well, that concludes our show for today. In the next episode, we will continue our case study of the deadly highways, followed by a potential solution. Until then, peace.